Evil is always a human choice and never part of God's plan.
Yet we must trust God's providence, even when we don't understand why tragedies happen.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here is your host and moderator.
Welcome, viewers, and thank you for choosing to spend your time with us today. My name is Andrea Luxton, and I am the president of Andrews University in Michigan and today's moderator. We have a complex and sensitive topic ahead of us, but before we move towards that, I'd like you to meet our panel.
My name is Bishop Michael Olson, and I serve as the Bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Fort Worth, Texas.
Hi, my name is Dan Levin. I serve as Senior Rabbi at Temple Bethel in Boca Raton, Florida.
I'm Tom Plumley. I'm a minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I serve as Senior Pastor at First Christian Church, Fort Worth, Texas.
Hi, I'm Carl Troval. I'm Professor of Ethics and History at Concordia University in Austin, Texas.
Thank you to our panelists, and here is today's topic. The Houston Chronicle recently reported on Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton's May 2022 comments in response to the Uvalde, Texas gun shooting, in which 19 students and 2 staff members were murdered. Paxton took 20 minutes to tell radio host Pastor Trey Graham about his Christian faith, about his belief in the Second Amendment, and why the United States should shift money spent on defending Ukraine to defending public schools. Towards the end of the interview, Pastor Graham gave Paxton time to comfort the victims of the Uvalde shooting. Paxton responded by saying, "If I lost one of my children, I'd be pretty devastated, especially in a way that is so senseless and seemingly has no purpose. I think I would just have to say, if I had the opportunity to talk to people, I'd have to say, look, there's always a plan. I believe God always has a plan. Life is short no matter what it is. And certainly we're not going to make sense of, a young child being shot and killed way before their life expectancy." It's the end of the quote. Negative responses to Paxton were strong. A father of one of the victims of the Parkland, Florida shooting, Fred Guttenberg, tweeted, "How dare you justify your failures by saying God has a plan and life is short no matter what. People like you are the reason, not any godly plan." We would like to know the thoughts of our panelists today on Paxton's comments, Guttenberg's reaction, and what it means that an event is God's plan. Here are 3 questions. Firstly, are tragedies like Uvalde really a part of God's plan? Are deaths that we can prevent also a part of God's plan? Secondly, from the perspective of your faith tradition, how would you comfort and guide the survivors of this shooting and the family and friends of those who were murdered? And finally, do the comments of believers in God like Paxton's demonstrate compassion or failure to listen or something else? I'll turn to our panelists and those that started our conversation.
Well, first, it's wonderful to be here and wish everybody hopefully recovering from a good Thanksgiving. These are very, very complicated questions, and I live just a few miles from Parkland, Florida, and so this shooting in Uvalde picks at a wound that I think people in my community carry very deeply, as I know that all of us do as Americans. And whenever we are confronted with something so tragic and so painful, there is a natural response to want to help others alleviate their pain and their suffering, and that we want to come up with some kind of an answer that will either make sense to us or, God willing, do something to comfort those who are bereft. And so we say things that inadvertently don't make it any better. And that's part of the challenge. The question about free will and God's plan in Jewish tradition is complicated. The rabbis in the Talmud have a really great way of summing it up. They say everything is foreseen and free will is given. So what does that mean? Well, it's the kind of thing where, like, when you're a parent and you see your child and you say, I know what's going to happen. You're going to watch television this afternoon, and then we're going to have dinner, and then you're going to take a shower, and you're going to be tired, and you're not going to feel like doing your homework. So I'm telling you, I know you're just never going to get that done. Now, do I know that my daughter's not going to get her homework done if that's what happens? No, but I know, right? And that's because I have intimate knowledge of how life works, and I have intimate knowledge of how my daughter's brain works. So if you take that to the nth degree, right, the Holy One has much greater knowledge of ours than even we have sometimes of ourselves. And so there is this sense that God kind of knows how it might play out. However, deeply rooted in our tradition is the idea that what makes us human is the fact that in every moment of every day of our lives, we have the capacity to make choice. Human choice and moral choice. And in fact, there is no morality unless we are given the capacity to make choice. In Deuteronomy 11, Moses teaches there are blessings and there are curses, and you need to choose the blessing. You need to choose the right path. And that's the most important element of what makes us human. God does not desire evil. God does not plan evil. God does not say, oh, you know what would be okay today is let's let 19 children in Uvalde, Texas get slaughtered. And it's an insult to the families to even presuppose the idea that something as horrible and tragic as that would be part of God's plan. You know, the greatest book in the Hebrew Scriptures that confronts how do you deal with inexplicable tragedy is the book of Job. And Job's friends do really well until they open their mouths. Until they try to explain away this horrible thing that Job has been beset with. And Job, to his credit, says, no, you're wrong. This is just pure tragedy and I didn't deserve it. And so when we're confronted with something as difficult and tragic as what happened in Parkland, Florida, Uvalde, Texas, or horrifically so often in so many communities around our country, the why question is generally not a good one, at least from a theological standpoint. The better question is what now? How will we respond as community and family in grief so that we can make meaning and redeem the evil that was visited on our lives by how we choose to respond? You know, I'm struck by how some of the families in Connecticut responded after their children were killed by saying, hey, we need to change some of the laws. We need to change. There was a woman, Scarlett Lewis, whose son Jesse was killed in Connecticut, and she formed a whole curriculum about how you teach emotional coping skills to adolescents so that the kind of tragedy that her family had to endure is not visited on others. And I think that's a far better path than trying to explain it away as, well, God must have wanted this. God never wants anything that evil.
Thank you. Bishop.
I agree with much of what the Rabbi says in the sense that as I looked at this in this conversation that's going on in a radio show, and really in the context of a religious radio show where the talk is about policies and laws, and then all of a sudden it takes a turn and a hypothetical is asked about how do you console, how would you comfort the parents of these children who were lost. That's never a hypothetical question. I think that, I mean, it's almost as insensitive to ask the question as it is to answer it or attempt to answer it. I think in a pastoral situation like this, it's inexplicable and no words will suffice, and presence is very important. I always notice too that God never offers the explanation, and I think that's a good example for us because He's present, and He's present even amidst the gift of our freedom, all right, which is in God's design for us. One of the things that's also, I think we've become less and less in our contemporary times willing to talk about. When we talk about evil, though, it's sort of this amorphous power or a lack of a good that should be there, or it's a disease. But we neglect sin. And I think sin is a very real theological, it's a theological reality. It can be explained theologically. And that is just simply there. And that's in my tradition. The background is always St. Augustine, an original sin is how he would describe the sin of the disobedience of Adam and Eve as the original sin. That, in a sense, brings this sort of disorder of the passions and of the mind that brings in not only sin and evil, but also ultimately death and its embitterment. Now, it is never a pastoral place to talk about theology in the abstract way in the midst of the mystery of evil when people are entering into that through grief and loss. I think ultimately what could be consoling for people, for me, in my own experience, is a sense of justice and mercy as exhibited by people who are there in their presence. And I think that's something that we cannot satisfy the irrational action that causes such grief and try to explain it away or contain it and see that somehow we can control it by our own categories and concepts.
Thank you. Carl?
I mean, I really appreciate both of what you had to say, and I completely reaffirm that in these kinds of situations, when you're doing pastoral care in any way, that it's important to speak compassionately, to spend time listening and hearing, and I'm to reassure people of God's love and presence, although they may not even be receptive of the words of that. But it is, I think it's that deep compassion is really critical. I think one other piece, at least in the Christian tradition, is an understanding that even God's chosen one, in Jesus Christ, suffered a violent death, and it's really inexplicable in the mystery of how could this possibly happen if this is God's chosen one? And so even there, God doesn't intervene on behalf of trying to save Christ from death. God intervenes in the resurrection, in raising him from the dead. But that also gives us something about realizing that it is a mystery ultimately we don't understand. But to make God the author of evil, and I think that's why I hate the language of God's plan, as if it's an architect, that here's the construction and this is how the world's going to go and here's our little piece in it. Like God constructed a play and we're all just playing our parts passively. That's why I really dislike that language. I understand its purpose. I mean, I think it is an attempt to say, listen, we're not in control of this situation, and we don't know how to make sense of it, and so somehow God's going to bring something good out of it. But that's a tough pill to swallow, I think, in a kind of concrete, practical sense. I think, though, I think the other piece of this that I struggle with is the sense of what's the responsibility. I mean, we still have the responsibility to try to prevent things like this from happening. I mean, I get it. Earthquakes, we don't have a whole lot of control over. Gun tragedies, it feels like we humans, we can't control every individual's acts. But at the same time, it seems like we can set up social structures that would prevent this kind of tragedy from happening, or at least minimize the number of that happening. And to me, that ends up being a question of not passively waiting for God to act, but to saying, how is God using me to change the situation? So,
Tom?
Thank you. As the last one here on the panel, let me say that just in sitting watching our panel conversation, I noted that Rabbi Levin began explaining how close he is to the horrible shooting in Parkland, and then the bishop and I live in a community that was torn apart with children and adults killed at Wedgwood Baptist Church back in the 90s, and then again at Westside Church of Christ in Fort Worth. And Carl is in a city that suffered perhaps the first of these that at least came to the consciousness of the American public back in 1966, when Charles Whitman got up in the tower of the at the University of Houston, the University of Texas. I'm sorry. So by golly, when are we going to say that enough is enough? When are we going to say that we got to start doing something about this? And this takes me to my point about God's plan. In my tradition, we don't do a whole lot of talking about God has a plan for this, except that we feel like it's better to talk about God's plan on the front end rather than God's plan on the back end. Because when we talk about God's plan on the front end, that moves us, that moves me potentially to act, to change, to do something, to be the kind of person that God wants me to be. When we talk about it on the back end, it's more of an excuse for why I didn't do something or why Ken Paxton didn't do something. I'm sorry, friends, the man's an embarrassment to the state of Texas. And for him to be able to take on the mantle of theologian or pastor and say something like that to the parents of those children in Uvalde and the family members of the teachers is just horrendous. For God did not have any plan for that to happen. Rather, God was working in every instant of that event, seeking for that boy to stop and seeking for law enforcement to get in there and do their jobs. And God was lying there with those children. Our Christian theology teaches us that God was absorbing their pain, absorbing those awful bullets, and suffering with those who were dying. Now, that's a long way from just cavalierly saying, oh, God had a plan that's going to work out in the end for all of us for good. That's just not true, and it's not fair, and it's not helpful in any sense.
I would say, in addition, Tom, that in our tradition, I really appreciate what you say about God having a plan on the front end, right? God paints a vision for what our society, what our world ought to look like, and then says to humanity created in God's image, you have a choice. And your choice is either to be my partner in bringing that vision to fruition, or you can make a choice to destroy that vision. And that is up to you in everything you do every day.
Yeah, what are all of our revelations about who God is that are recorded for us in Scripture? other than that to say that God wants us to act in certain ways.
Thank you. Time for break.
We hope you're enjoying today's program. If you'd like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the vision and history of the program, and we invite you to become a ministry partner, explore our Town Hall Estates healthcare facilities, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, we look forward to receiving your letters. You may write us at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. If you have a prayer request, please send it to prayerrequest@americanreligious.org. Thank you for writing and thank you for watching. Now, back to today's closing statements.
Thank you for coming back and joining us for the final part of our program today. And I want to turn to our panelists and ask them for their concluding comments.
When we confront evil, especially not just as a theoretical concept, but when we really confront evil, the physical evil of sickness, the moral evil of sin, including murder, there's always the natural human tendency to ask why. And that tendency, though, also cannot be satisfied with any answer at all. And so when we try to impose reasons where reasons are not found, cannot be found, it leads to further frustration, especially when we attempt to offer those reasons to people who are really in the midst of suffering and grief. When the question of God's plan, I think God, in a sense, has a design in his created order, but part of that design involves freedom. And what comes to mind as a metaphor is the design of blueprints that soon take on the character of not plan, but a project. And we share in that project by how we do good, by how we avoid evil, by how we do our best to prevent evil, and by how we console those who are affected by evil.
Yes, let's talk about God's project. Let's talk about those who are standing in the way of God's project, what God is trying to do to bring peace to our streets and to our schools and safety and health, that all of our children might grow up to be healthy and whole. Let's talk about God's plan, which tends to be used as a sop to distract us from what God truly wills and tries in every instant to bring to pass. Let's talk about people's plans to keep that from happening. And let's change our ways.
I think one of my real struggles is the question of God has the power to act, and yet God doesn't act in these situations, which is another angle of the same question. I don't believe that God's the author of evil. Humans do that evil. They frustrate God's plan. But the other question for me is, in our tradition, because God is omnipotent, the struggle is why doesn't God do something to prevent these tragedies? Is it because God's trying to teach us something, to be responsible, to engage in that activity? I mean, I think that's part of it, but that is not very satisfying. And I realize I'm opening up a whole nother can of worms here, but I think that that's one angle that we haven't really addressed. There's a cartoon I saw. It had all these buttons on it, and it had prayers and thoughts, thoughts and prayers, thoughts and prayers, and then there's a button in the middle that says do something. And I love the cartoon, but the flip side is that I'm thinking, well, I don't want to undermine the need for prayer and trust in God to do something. And I guess I have to go back to the old monastic, right, command, pray and work, right? It's not of choosing one or the other, but one is to pray and pray for the victims, pray for peace, pray for justice, but also then to do something and to act as well, to work in the labor of making the world conform to God's vision of it.
I'm reminded of the wonderful book written a generation ago by Rabbi Harold Kushner called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And the title is not why bad things happen, it's when bad things happen. And he talks about, a town where a tornado blows through town and destroys every house on one side of the street and leaves every house intact on the other side of the street. Well, does that mean that everybody on that side that had their house destroyed deserved it and everyone on the other side? No. Tornadoes blow through towns, right? We live in a broken world. In a broken world, bad things happen. There's disease, there's tornado, there's flood, there's storm, there's awful. And, there's a difference, however, between evil that is from the natural world and evil that humanity visits on other human beings. So people say, well, how come God didn't stop Auschwitz? And the answer is it wasn't God's job to stop Auschwitz. It was humanity's job to stop Auschwitz. It's humanity's responsibility to eradicate evil. Where God is exactly, Tom, I believe, where you are. Helping those who are in pain and in anguish find within themselves the strength and the vision to find a way to move forward, to make meaning, and to do something that will redeem the tragedy from which they seek to recover.
Thank you very much. Viewers, I hope today that you've heard not just our words, but also our hearts, because I think that everyone on this panel, and certainly speaking for myself as moderator too, our hearts are there with those of you who may be facing that personal sense of loss or tragedy by the unspeakable acts that just seem to make no sense at all. So please know that from us, how sorry we are for the tragedies that you've had to deal with. And our God says to us, we want to be there, make a difference, make change, be part of a solution that both is there to support you, but also to set better paths for the future. The Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American rights to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. And now, friends, until next week, at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. And may the God of all of us bless all of you.